Today's podcast is brought to you by Progresso Talent Partners, who for more than 25 years have successfully delivered interim and permanent leadership talent to transform businesses. To hire the talent you need to enable your business to thrive, visit www.progressotalent.com today. Today on Extrology, we're diving into the life of a man who embodies resilience, reinvention, and purpose. From a childhood marked by upheaval as a refugee to becoming a pop star influencing a presidential election, Christian Ray Flores has lived a life that reads like a movie script. But that's just the beginning. Now an entrepreneur, coach and philanthropist, Christian has turned his experiences into a mission to empower others to live extraordinary lives. We'll explore the highs, the lows, and the lessons learned along the way, what drives him, what keeps him pushing forward, and what he sees as the secret to thriving in a world full of possibilities. So what's the story behind the story? Without further ado, let's get into it. Christian Ray Flores, welcome to Extrology. Great to have you here today as my guest. And for the benefit of readers, perhaps you could just start by explaining where do we find you on this fine January 2025 day?
Well, Lee, thanks for having me. I am in Austin, Texas, and it's unusually cold here. So if you're listening in the UK and the Celsius space, it's probably a little bit under 15 centigrade, and then it's about 40 Fahrenheit, which for Texas is very cold.
Well, given, and we're going to come on to the incredible kind of journey on which you've been, certainly from a geographic perspective, your exposure to countless climates through the course of your life, as you'll be very familiar with Europe, I suspect, and therefore you will be fully aware that that sounds like a wonderfully warm temperature to enjoy right now. So given that we're on the verge of snow here in the UK, certainly. So let's dive into our conversation. And I think on that subject of your journey, it's a tapestry of incredible experiences across continents and disciplines in terms of the things that you've done. How do you usually describe your story to someone who perhaps is meeting you for the first time?
Well, I think professionally, I basically say I'm professionally ADHD. And that seems actually to be a trend. More people are like me now. I feel less weird than I used to in the past. And then when it comes to just geography, I'm a third culture person, basically. You know, there's a term that was coined, I think, in the 1800s called third culture kid. And these are kids who sort of travel from place to place and they retain some of the original culture, and then they borrowed from some of the host culture, and then they formed a third culture, which is sort of in the middle. So I've done that several times. You know, I grew up in 4 countries, 3 continents. This is actually now my 6th country in my 4th continent. So that adds a layer of eclecticism, I would say, on all kinds of levels.
And that, I think, in terms of how that, and we'll get into this, how that shapes you, how you evolve as a consequence, I think that's a fascinating topic to dig into. But before we do that, your phrase kind of professionally ADHD, I think you make an interesting point. It struck me as you commented there that if I look at perhaps my father's generation, who's now in his very late 70s, but you know, that was a generation that you left study and you became something that you were called: engineer, plumber, lawyer, builder, you name it. There was something that you were described as, and then you did that, and then you retired. And we now live in a world where we have this incredible kind of versatility and multitude of opportunity, which is scary on one hand, but incredibly exciting on the other. And it sounds like that's something that you've been able to embrace wholeheartedly, if perhaps not necessarily maybe by design, but nonetheless, you've certainly by opportunity.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's more of a thing now than when I sort of followed my natural inclinations, but my natural inclinations ended up being that way, you know. So I didn't necessarily choose it, but I did eventually embrace it as something of a positive thing rather than a negative thing.
I think it sets you up well for the world in which we find ourselves. I read a report recently here in the UK that suggested that, so if we're looking at current teenage slash early 20s. By the age of 35, they will have changed careers, not jobs, but careers 7 times. Now, who does this sort of research? I'm
Mm-hmm.
never quite sure how they derive these kind of numbers, but nonetheless, it's incredible to think that actually the idea that you might be something which for so often defined us, or we found ourselves to be defined by what we called ourselves, that's really shaky. Yes, it's really been shaken up. It's really changing. But I think in terms
It
of,
really is, and I
yeah,
think I'm actually there's a really good book if you're interested in the topic called Range: Why Generalists Are Victorious Over Specialists. It's written by this guy David Epstein, and he speaks about that actually not just as a modern phenomenon, but as a general statement, as a sweeping statement on some of the most extraordinary people that we know. They did a lot of that early on. They did not specialize early; they specialized late. So he makes a really, really good case that for me, it's really more of a, I'm reading this book. I already know this. I'm reading this to feel a little bit more normal, right? But I think it's really a really good read, really good insights, actually.
and it's an interesting point. And what is normal? That's an interesting. I mean, that's a podcast in itself,
Yeah.
right? In terms of how we might. But let's go a little back to your early life, and we touched on kind of the geographic flavour to your journey, and you'd an early life that's taken you from, as I understand it, from Chile to Russia via Germany and Mozambique, which is again back to that word eclectic, a real mix of cultural experiences, a real hodgepodge of cultures through growing
Mm-hmm.
up. How did those transitions, do you think, shape your character and also your worldview?
Uh, Tremendously, actually, just absolutely tremendously, because they all happened very early on, right? And basically, the backstory is that I was born in Moscow. My mom's Russian, my dad's Chilean, so that's an eclectic mix right there. We moved to Chile when I was just a few months old, and we were going to stay there, but there was a military coup there, a lot of social unrest. My dad was in a concentration camp. We were in a refugee facility. We got sort of kicked out of the country, got asylum in Germany, went back to Russia eventually, and then to Africa when my dad got a job there. So all of those things happened in a very short period of time. So by age 7, I had changed 4 countries, 3 continents. And not only were there 4 countries, but four very, very different cultures, right? Everything is different between Russia, Soviet Union, right? Russia, West Germany, Chile, and Mozambique. It's just, it's hard to imagine a more different and eclectic change of settings at such an early age. So it did really almost like imprint certain things in me, early on.
Well, I can only imagine, given that we are of a similar age, and growing up for me, there was, to your point, the Soviet Union, West Germany, the Berlin Wall. Before the wall came down, there was an entirely different world.
Absolutely.
And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what are your recollections of, accepting you're very young, but those sort of very early memories? Do you have any particular memories that really stand out for you?
Really, a lot actually. My earliest one was around. I was 5 years old, and I know for a fact that it's a recollection because I don't have any photos from that period. It's holding my mom's hand, standing outside of this soccer stadium. They used soccer stadiums for concentration camps
Goodness.
in Chile post the military coup, and she was passing on I think it was a paper bag or something like that, or it's just a little packet of food to a soldier trying to pass food to my dad, who was inside. And I remember so distinctly, and I think it's because of fear, right? And then we spent a few months in a refugee facility at United Nations ran, and I remember that very clearly as well. And I think it's just this sensation of danger, instability, the unknown, 100% uncertainty, right? Even at that age, I could feel it, right? I didn't understand it, but I could feel it. And being in Germany, I remember as well the sort of arrival to the airport. The mayor was there to greet us. They were just so generous with us. So grateful for nations who offered asylum to all those refugees from Chile at the time. And I think there was a total of 200,000 people who left the country and actually were kicked out early on and blacklisted. so that put an imprint. Going back to the Soviet Union was really strange for me because we ended up in this communal apartment. It was very depressing to me, on a number of levels. Communal apartment, old, decrepit sort of building. We shared an apartment with a family, like a elderly couple who they occupied one room, and then our whole family of four occupied two other rooms, and we shared a hallway, a bathroom, and a kitchen. And I remember that as a time of scarcity, cold weather, grayness, and then I got really sick because of the climate, I think. So I spent a lot of time in hospitals, like a lot of time. I had chronic bronchitis that turned into pneumonia. And so I would go back into pneumonia over and over again. I ended up being hospitalized for a while. And I mean, that whole Soviet system the individual does not mean anything in those societies, So like my parents couldn't come in. I could only wave from them from the window of my little hospital window from the third floor. And I just cried and cried and cried. And so things like that was very traumatic. And then my dad left for Africa, and he left ahead of us to set things up and to have a place for us to come to. And I was supposed to follow with my mom way later because she was finishing up a degree in nursing at the time, which was her second college degree. The first one is in French. And she ended up basically telling my dad, look, I think he's going to die if he stays here. And I'm going to send him to you, So like I remember so distinctly going from the airport to the plane. And at the time, they didn't have those arms where you can walk straight into the plane. You have to walk, the tarmac. And I was walking in an actual blizzard to the plane. And they sent me to Africa alone with a family that was traveling there, And a few hours later, maybe it was 20 hours later, something like that. I remember walking out of the plane, and of course, it's the opposite season, right? It's the southern hemisphere, and I just remember that the heat and the tropical smell of tropical. How that there's a distinct tropical smell that is very specific. And then I get off. I'm 7 years old. My dad is late actually to pick me up, which was hilarious. So I'm just sitting there. And I see all these African Black people walking around that I have never seen one before, and a completely different race, language, everything. And I go from this apartment in the Soviet Union, no car, of course. I mean, we were pretty poor. And my dad picks me up in this white Dodge with red leather interior that looked like a rocket ship to me at the time. And he takes me through this wondrous place that is just very third world, right? But he got us a nice little town home, and he had a tropical garden in the back. It was just shocking. Like it was shocking to go from one world to the next world, to the next world, and to the next world over again by age 7. Yeah, that's what I remember.
How do you think those transitions have shaped the person you are today?
I've thought about it quite a bit, and obviously I do a lot of mentorship and coaching now. So, I draw on those things to help other people. And for me, there's a few things that stand out. One is this. One is a sense of constant uncertainty. If it's processed well, it creates the opportunity to become a very successful entrepreneur, because if nothing is certain, everything is possible. And I don't know, magically through whatever, I ended up sort of having that mindset fairly early on. It served me the rest of my life, where I go, oh, there's trouble, there's instability, it doesn't scare me, right? Danger doesn't scare me as it scares a normal person. And instability, uncertainty doesn't scare me. So I'm more prone to taking risks. And that has paid off over and over again. And there's ways to actually sort of mimic that in real life and train yourself to be better at that. The other thing that comes to mind as an interesting advantage is, when you're a child, especially, you really want to fit in. There's a profound desire to fit in. So if you switch cultures and languages all the time and you want to fit in, you develop an almost supernatural ability to read people and read culture and learn new things, So, and I ended up learning 4 languages by age 9, right? So I arrived with 2 languages, Russian and Chilean, and Spanish rather. And then they sent me to an African school, like right away, like complete cold turkey. go and learn the language. And there's nobody there. There's no expats, just Africans, right, speaking Portuguese. And I learned Portuguese in a year. And then they sent me to this international school, which is where all the expats were. And it was all in English. So then like a year later, I'm like, okay, what's English? So the ability to learn at an accelerated rate, that's another thing. And then culture, understanding how culture works, how it affects human behavior, how to read, how to get along with people. Those are all just extraordinary gifts from those times that are, at the time it didn't feel like fun, but it definitely became a massive superpower sort of thing.
I'd imagine as a consequence, and I'm making all sorts of broad sweeping kind of psychological assessments that I'm ill qualified to do so, but the resilience that you're acquiring, you're building a resilience. I'm sure it wouldn't have felt like that at the time, but through great adversity, you're building tremendous resilience, communication capability, cultural awareness, an awareness of people and emotional intelligence that you're naturally having to equip yourself with, without, respectfully, I'd imagine, not really knowing what that was at 8, 9 years old, but nonetheless, you're developing a range of skills that have been, are incredibly, I don't even want to say useful, I want to say powerful, but I mean that in a very positive way as opposed to in a negative sense, but hugely beneficial. I clearly wouldn't have felt like that at the time.
All of it is true. You're absolutely right. And at the time, it was painful and exciting all at the same time. My dad tells me that I was silent for about a year. In public settings, I just wouldn't speak. And he was worried about me. And he goes, why do you not, I'm taking you to a party or to a get together, this and that. And I said, Dad, I don't know the language. I don't know how I fit into this. And so I went quiet for a full year, but then eventually you sort of emerge from that, almost like a recalibration with the capability to communicate across multiple channels. So to give you an illustration, our lunch or dinner table in the family looked like crazy people were talking from the outside, because my dad would literally say something in Spanish. My mom could, without missing a beat, answer him in Russian. And then my sister and I could communicate either of those languages or throw in some Portuguese. And sometimes we could literally use two languages in the same sentence because there was a specific word that was more appropriate for the thing that we're trying to describe. So this fluency and almost like a toolbox that you get at the end of it was fascinating. And that's sort of the third culture kid strangeness, I guess, So, and if anyone's listening and you grew up in multiple places, I'm sure you're nodding your head right now going, yeah, that's exactly how it was. So
how do you think that early experience, we've talked about how it influenced your character and how that developed, but what about your world, your view of the world? Because you have quite a, arguably not unique, respectfully, but nonetheless interesting, very different perspective on, given that so many of us tend to sort of grow up in one, maybe two places, we might move around a little bit, but oftentimes within the same country, you've got a very different perspective than many.
I think for me, there's a few things there. One is because my early imprint is literally concentration camp, refugee, and then we land in Mozambique, and we had this community of Chilean exiles there who were imported essentially by the government to help rebuild the country. The country had gotten its independence maybe a couple of years before I arrived, so it's brand new. The country was brand new. Everything was brand new. And the Chileans that were contacted and imported, most of them were imprisoned or tortured or both, and all of them were exiled for ideological reasons and things like that. So I developed this uncharacteristically young perspective on human nature, on justice, on violence, on tyranny, because those are the things that they would talk about when they would get together, right? They would have meetings and go to parties and talk about really heavy stuff, really adult, grown-up stuff, not small talk. So I developed this just early on passion for justice, for causes, and then all of them actually came essentially as secular. They were all Marxist. They were secular missionaries, right? They were there to help rebuild the country. And some of them came from very prosperous places like Canada or France, and they still came to Africa receiving almost no money. And they just gave the country 5-10 years of their lives, and they would run hospitals or colleges or gold mines. My dad was an engineer in a transportation company. So I developed an early on sort of thing. Well, look, you're supposed to serve something bigger than yourself, and like to this day, I have a nonprofit in Mozambique that I started, an after school academy called the Ascend Academy. But for decades, I have devoted myself to Christian ministry or philanthropy or helping refugees in Ukraine. And that always felt like not even a choice, but a must. This is an essential. This is a central thing. I must be that way. It makes me feel fulfilled and whole and right. And almost to the detriment of not almost actually to the detriment of my other side, which is very entrepreneurial. So I've started different companies and had like 5 different careers, but I've always chosen a cause over commerce, right? And in my particular case, I'm not saying that to brag. I'm saying that's a bad thing, basically. It's too much. So I had to force myself to course correct and solve for commerce in order to even continue the cause. But that's like a deep ingrained thing. The other, I think, part is I've learned that journey essentially put me in a position to see Marxist and neo-Marxist experiments in literally 3 different continents by age 7, right? Because the coup was to overthrow a president in Chile who was a socialist. And my mom and dad were supporters of him. My mom spoke at one of his rallies. My dad actually met him and, gave him a tour of the factory he was working on at the time. Obviously, the Soviet Union was the mothership of Marxist sort of ideologies, plus China. And then Mozambique actually chose the Marxist way. So at the time, most of the countries that got their independence in Africa and also elsewhere, they would pick a side, essentially, because it was a proxy war of ideologies all over the world. And so I saw what they did, that Marxist government in Africa. So when we went back to the Soviet Union, then I get an economics degree. I have a master's degree in economics. So I actually studied Karl Marx, wrote papers, and actually read The Capital, right, by Karl Marx and Engels and some other works. So I ended up switching sides very dramatically through experiencing those things and through studying those things. And when I became a successful artist in Russia in the 90s, I used that platform to help Boris Yeltsin actually defeat the communists, because that was the last time the communists were coming. They were actually leading in the polls. So that is a massive imprint, right? And I think to this day, I have a very strange sort of experience. I can almost like credibility in a sense, right? Experiential credibility, maybe that's a good word, to say, look, Marxism is not a good thing. It's an evil thing. And I can tell you why, because I've not only know about it, but I've seen it and I've lived it.
I'm fascinated to just delve a little bit more into becoming a recording artist in Russia. And to your point, having that music influence a presidential campaign must have been somewhat surreal. I want to talk about the lessons you take from that chapter of your life. But before I do so, I'm interested to understand how you got there.
Oh, to the music part?
Yeah.
It was also it was a very also squiggly line, so to say, because no one in my family was an entertainer or a musician. Well, I have distant relatives on the Chilean side who were sort of literary geniuses and stuff like that. But there's no direct correlation because I didn't have a relationship with them. But I was very musical since I was a kid. So I had a good voice and I would sing at home. And mom and dad would basically say, please sing to our visitors. They had visitors over and I would perform and do something, And then we had a little choir in Mozambique. It was a Chilean children's choir. And we performed, these Latin American classics from Brazil and Argentina and Colombia and Chile. And at little parties, or we performed for the president of Mozambique at the time. And but that was just really more of a hobby. But I remember when I was in that choir was the first time where I felt something like a state of flow, like when we would sing together, I would feel like I'm levitating. I would feel this is where I belong, sort of. And it was just a hint of that, but it was never, I never considered it seriously until way later. We moved back to Russia. It was after my parents' divorce. I was devastated, and the adjustment was really harsh because we went back into pretty much poverty. 1-bedroom apartment. I slept in the kitchen for years. I had a little pull-out chair in the kitchen. And then after halfway through college, I started getting into creative things. I started breakdancing. There was like an underground movement of breakdancers, behind the Iron Curtain still, and there was like maybe 100 of us for the whole country. And we would meet underground to train, like quite literally. And I became really good at it, really good at it. And then it sort of reemerged, bubbled up as, I can dance, I can sing. Maybe I can be an artist, and it was just a hint of a thing. And then I finished college and I went into international trade. Like I was this very low level, like almost like an intern level at an international trading company. And I was really, really bored, and I thought, I'm going to give it a try. I can live in a shoebox. Why not? And it coincided with the freedom of everything. Free market, free speech, free everything, which was a very short period of time in the history of Russia. And it was right after the fall of the Soviet Union. So there was an actual chance to make it because nothing was top down anymore, And so I started hustling, and I was in the sort of almost like in the showbiz circles. I was the entourage, because I didn't have anything to show for what I could do. And then I met somebody who had a studio, and he said, "You look like an artist." And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, I have a studio. And at the time you couldn't record anywhere else but a studio. There was no home studio, even technology developed yet. So he said, "I'll give you some night hours if you want to show me something." And I said, "Absolutely." He goes, "Who's going to write the songs?" "I'm going to write the songs." "Who's going to write the lyrics?" "I'm going to write the lyrics." I went home. I've never written a song or a lyric in my life, but I said I will to him. And then I came back with my first song, and he liked it, and we started recording. And it was this very gradual but very intense, like a very intentional process for me, like a year, 2 years of creating a product. And all of my stuff, right? My eclectic musical taste, my exposure to Western music, my entrepreneurial spirit, everything is possible if nothing is certain. And I learned a lot. Of my learning, I would read whole books of biographies of musicians in music studios. I could tell you my favorite artists, who they were, who produced it, who was the arranger, what studio they recorded, what label they were attached to, how much money they got for it. I studied the business side of it. So I became sort of all of these things for some reason all coalesced right into this one effort. And we did a few songs. I was hired at a little local club to do some gigs. And then by the end of year one, I had 3 contracts offered to me, and then it was like very, very fast actually. So year 2, maybe it was small clubs, medium venues. Year 3, national television, radio, millions of copies sold, sports arenas. It was that quick.
And what lessons did you take from that chapter of your life?
Well, I think that's sort of what makes you, if you are entrepreneurial, at least somewhere like under the surface, that doesn't necessarily explode into existence until you have your first experience of success. And I think for me, it forever imprinted that I can do something out of nothing. I can be that kind of creator, right? Not only in music, but in business as well. Because entrepreneurs are essentially artists in the business world. And I sort of really developed the ability to see how that can happen. And it was an early gift because I was in my literally early 20s when that all happened. So now a lot of the work that I do with founders or entrepreneurs as a coach and professionals in general is I help them sort of reverse engineer the process of recalibrating career, starting something completely at a higher level that they didn't think possible. Maybe they dreamt about it, but they never had sort of the courage, perhaps, to take that step, to take it to a whole new level and be actual top performers, key people of influence in their spaces. And I feel like I know the mechanics of that, both internal, psychological, and external. And that gift was developed from that first experience, and it was because it was so early,
And I'd imagine because it was so early, I mean, the likes of artists that live lifetimes, McCartney, I don't know. I was trying to think of all sorts of different artists that were springing to mind that are still around and still performing and still selling out stadiums. McCartney was the first one that sprung to mind. But there are also lots of kind of that meteoric rise, and then there's a lot of uncertainty that comes with it. There are inevitably setbacks. How do you've reached the heights, you're selling out sports stadiums, you're influencing presidential campaigns. I'd imagine there are inevitably moments of uncertainty or setbacks that follow. How do you navigate them?
I mean, I dealt with some of these things better than others. I think on a professional level, I was pretty well equipped, and I just had a backbone to me when it comes to that. And on a personal level, it really devastated me, actually. So I was unprepared to what fame does to people, how you see yourself in society. So, and you're sort of arrogant when you're in your 20s anyway. Like I have 20-year-old daughters. I have 3 of them, and oh my gosh, the arrogance is just through the roof. But it just comes with the territory. You're adulting for the first time. You're having your first successes. You haven't really been humbled by life sufficiently to even believe that you're, destructible. So it just comes with the territory. It's just the downside of having that high energy, high ambition, and low obstacle sort of, which is a very short period of time usually, right? Life will teach you eventually. So it was that. And for me, actually, you mentioned McCartney, and that was sort of one interesting thing. I realized that I didn't like it very much for the long run.
Interesting.
I was on a train ride, and I was going from city to city. I had like 20 people traveling with me at the time, so sort of an entourage. And I was sitting alone in the car. For some reason, I was alone in that particular moment, and I had that thought, is this all there is for me? And it was a very scary thought because I was living the dream of, most musicians would never experience this, what I was experiencing. But I was deeply dissatisfied, I realized. And I realized that although I am living the dream of this almost like stereotypical musician, that's all they want forever. That wasn't me, right? I did not want to be doing music when I was 60 or 70 or even 50. I spoke 4 languages. I wanted to travel the world. I wanted to build a family, and I knew that building a family would probably clash with the lifestyle. I wanted to do philanthropy. I'm an economics major, so I'm like, I should start some businesses. I should go somewhere else. Basically, it was like all these things together, and that's sort of where I would say the ability to face uncertainty came in handy. Is that I literally, at the peak of my career, quit my career at the very peak, which was just insane, right? For people, like my whole crew thought I was insane. The press went wild.
The strength required to do that in the face of, I can imagine, the pressure not to, because I would imagine, I've not been in the music industry, but we hear lots of stories as to, well, it's not only the artist there's a lot of people around the artist that are relying on that artist to generate income for them too, right? So there's a whole kind of, I'd imagine the Soviet or Russia as it would have been at the time, but no different. That model is well documented. So tremendous pressure. So the strength required to know, one, the strength of mind to know this isn't it. This isn't me now. This is me now, but it's not me forever. I think that takes tremendous strength, and all credit to you for realizing that.
Yeah, it did, and I think I wouldn't even say it was strength. Maybe on surface, yes, there is some strength, right, connected. But I would say the ability to go, okay, I'm actually fine with facing instability to pursue a higher purpose, and I think the ability to take risks in the face of uncertainty, and the ability to. And I had a deep desire to live very authentically and live for a purpose that is higher than myself. Those 2 factors are probably the things that helped me, benefited me, and also made it very hard because, you make very decisive actions like that, and the economic repercussions are pretty intense. I lost, you know, I've made some calculations. That's it's like a form of self torture, I guess. Probably $15 million in the 90s I lost, just by walking away, so things like that. And but I gained so much more from it, right?
Like what, for example?
Well, I did some Christian ministry in Moscow, which was very, very enriching to me experientially, because you jump into a completely different space, and it's humbling because you don't have the skills, but you grow very fast. I did a lot of philanthropic work in Russia at the time. We worked with orphans. And think about this, right? I started doing philanthropy because I saw We Are the World and Band Aid in Great Britain. And I was like, I'm a musician. I grew up in the third world, and these musicians are using their platform to help the poor. I want in, basically. That was sort of the big aha. And I had a platform. So we organized these big events for thousands and thousands of orphans in sports arenas. And we had a sports festival during the day and a night performance. All these celebrities came in, and I recruited them, and I was a celebrity. So I was living something that I never thought, like growing up in Africa or behind the Iron Curtain. I never thought ever that I would have this kind of life or opportunity. And at the peak of it, I used to dream. I used to imagine myself being in the room with Band Aid, right, or in Wembley, and We Are the World, and how would it be to be there in that crowd of just the most talented people in the world. And I'm doing this festival a few years later, and we have this crazy idea to invite Michael Jackson to the event. And the chances are zero, very close to zero. And then he shows up. Like, to see the guy who inspired my music career to walk in the room in this big arena where there's thousands of kids, and I'm like 3 feet away from him. I never thought this would even be a reality. That's the payoff, right? Of taking just crazy leaps. But you never know what's going to happen. You have to have faith. You have to have some sort of vision and the boldness to pursue it. But if you think about it, I'll tell you another story. I'm in high school. This is still behind the Iron Curtain, and I was a terrible student. So I would sit there and draw these drawings in my notebook of like Adidas and Nike, like these are all symbols of prosperity, of opportunity, of entrepreneurship. I like the logo for KISS, particularly because it has that double lightning S at the end. And I also knew that none of those things at the time, no one knew the Soviet Union was going to fall apart. So none of those things were accessible to me. I would never, ever see Michael Jackson or KISS live, let alone anything else, right? It was just a few years later, my first artistic sort of successes. I had an endorsement deal with Adidas, and my poster was in all the Adidas stores. I had a shampoo commercial with Head and Shoulders, and they were shown across 15 countries in the post-Soviet space. I had an endorsement deal with Guess. Michael Jackson came to my event. It's just insanity, right? It's incredible how vision sometimes generates very unlikely outcomes. And then you fast forward moving to the States. We moved to the States, and I had to start over. I'm nobody here. No one knows or cares who I am, in Russia. And I, ended up I had a production company in Hollywood. All of a sudden I'm sitting in the Hollywood Hills in the studio of one of my jazz inspirations early on. I grew up, a lot of my musical influences came from jazz. And there was this guy called George Duke, who was a producer of Michael Jackson, Anita Baker, and, like countless other people. And I'm sitting in his studio, and I'm friends with him. I'm collaborating with him on a project for an Eastern European artist. I produced an album for a rock band in Eastern Europe, and we produced it with the producer of KISS in the studio of KISS. And I hired one of the guitar players to record a solo for me there. What I'm telling you is that all these stories came to be because you imagine something and you just take one baby step at a time. And I think it's more than luck. That's sort of my theory, And I wouldn't have done any of those things if I hadn't quit my music career. I still have really good friends in Russia who are my peers, essentially. We started to and they're still playing big venues. but they only have that one track, right? And I'm sure they're happy doing it because it's very stable, very predictable. It's a good living. I probably would be deeply dissatisfied with that outcome.
I read that you described having mentors and coaches that's been a real help to you. And I wonder as to the specific lessons or practices that perhaps you've taken from those mentors or coaches that you're carrying forward to help others.
Yeah, my first experience was I was 26 years old, and I had a number one hit called Our Generation, which became one of the anthems for Boris Yeltsin's campaign. And I was clinically depressed because I split up. My girlfriend had left me, and she had a baby. We had a baby together, and she left. And she left because I was an idiot. And I was completely devastated. And I met this guy who's a Christian missionary, Canadian guy, who, I'm sitting in his kitchen having dinner with him, and he has this family dynamic that I've never seen before. And I said, "How do I get what you have?" That was sort of that's word for word what I said to him, and he knew exactly what I meant. And he said, "I'll teach you." And there was something that went off in my mind. I have all the reasons to be arrogant and prideful, and I'm a huge star at the time. And I've very consciously humbled myself before this man because I saw something very intuitively. This guy can see around corners, corners that I can't see. This guy has character qualities and insights that I don't have, that I was never given in life, actually. I come from 3 generations of broken homes. This guy has wisdom that I need to succeed in life. And I basically said, I'll just do, and just tell me what to do. And I made myself indispensable to him. We're still really good friends. I just saw him yesterday. He's in Austin miraculously. His kids ended up in Austin. Now he's spending half of his time in Austin, Texas. Who knew? It's just crazy, like of all places on earth. And I just followed him around like a puppy, right? Like a child. That's what I treated him like. Karate Kid treated Mr. Miyagi. That's how I treated him. Except I was not a child. I was a grown-up, a very successful professional. And I think any professional, especially if you're at the top level of performance, you should have a coach or a mentor of some kind where you have high accountability, frequent contact, a lot of trust built, a lot of vulnerability, and you will see your life be transformed in ways you can't even imagine because it accelerates your growth. That's one thing. So what would have taken you 10 years, it would take you 6 months, And also there's dimensions of life that you will learn. If you have blind spots and weaknesses, those things don't get fixed quickly at all, especially if you're successful and busy. They persist and they slow you down. Eventually they grind you down to a halt. Sometimes they bring you down, especially if you're very successful professionally. So to have that kind of presence in your life, it's worth all the money in the world. And it's very hard to find. And I've worked very diligently. I'm going to turn 56 in March. I have 5 people in my life who I have nurtured, thanked, pursued in a very disciplined way. And they're like my board of directors, right? They all see around corners that I don't see. They're all farther along in one way or another. It could be professionally, relationally, spiritually, family, parenting, all of those things. And I treasure them so, so very much. And I'm able to perform at a high level across more dimensions because I have them in my life. And most people have no idea that this is even possible. At best, you have a friend who can give you advice every once in a while. And I would say, look, if you want to be successful in life, you can't afford not to have that, basically.
You've achieved success across so many fields. I'm interested to understand what's kept you striving for more, constantly striving rather than just staying comfortable. I suspect I know this, but I don't want to make any assumption. I'm interested to understand why. What drives you? What keeps you going for more?
I love people. I think that's love. I love serving people. I think I just want to help more people. I want to serve more people, more clients. I have a digital media company. I want to tell great stories through the media, the brand strategy company that I run. All of them are very small boutique sort of things. I'm not. I live in the city of Elon Musk now, right? Like Tesla is taking over, but it's not really my that kind of scale is not really my desire. It doesn't attract me. I focus on boutique with high impact, like a domino effect, right? So we just finished the logo for NASA, for example, a NASA science project. NASA science projects, I think it's the department. We've done 3 logos for them so far. We work with sort of individuals who want to develop a personal brand strategy, that sort of thing. We've done award-winning websites and videos and things like that. None of those things are sort of on a global scale, but they're all on a world-class level. So to me, it's really quality over quantity, really connected to my passion. Like I want my fingerprints over it. And then the coaching stuff that I do is same thing. My desire is to help world changers do it better and longer at the peak of their abilities. That's essentially my gift to them. And it's really exciting to see them succeed, right? I think that's what drives me. So it's a very good question. I don't know, perhaps, but I honestly, my instinct tells me that it's love. I love people. I really, really love people, and I believe in them.
So perhaps, given that love, what is it that makes you angry or frustrated about the world today?
Tyranny makes me frustrated. Destructive ideologies make me frustrated because they corrupt whole generations, like millions of people. Like you see the war in Ukraine. We took a trip there. We started working with refugees literally on the 6th day of the war. We started sending money and we raised, a little bit under 300,000 for Ukraine and helped hundreds of people there. And we established a couple of centers there. And Deb and my wife and I went there 2 years ago. So this is the middle of the war. And just to see, the human cruelty, right? I spoke to people who were bombed, who had to be dug out of buildings. I spoke to people who saw children being abducted, whole schools, busloads. We saw people. I can't even retell you some of the stories just because it's going to depress you, right? We were there looking at buildings that were just cut in half, and there's, washing machines hanging from the massive gap in the middle, and minefields, and just the collective grief, of the Ukrainians. And this is because some people up high on all kinds of levels, on all kinds of countries, not just Russia and Ukraine, decided to do certain things a certain way, and that really angers me, in the US as well. There's all kinds of things that derail whole generations and large groups of people. And basically my desire is to help the individual flourish. And, I wrote a book called Little Book of Big Reasons to Love America with basically 10 chapters, 10 reasons why America created essentially an ecosystem for individual flourishing that is optimal. And a lot of those it's a very fragile set of circumstances, values, cultural nuances, things that almost like the stars aligned a certain way. It's a fragile thing. It's not normal. And even in America, a lot of those things are getting lost, So I wrote it not out of a sense of almost like American exceptionalism. Really more, it's like, okay, this is almost a miracle that happened at its best. And I'm a recipient of the national sins of the U.S., by the way, because the military coup in Chile happened because the CIA intervened in Chile. They overthrew a democratically elected government, as long as he doesn't, they tolerated a military dictator as long as he's pro-American, more than they tolerated a democratically elected because he was Marxist, So, America has done a lot of bad things in the world. That's not the point. The point is it also created an environment of extraordinary entrepreneurship, creativity, freedom, family values, faith, charity. It's a very charitable culture. People are very, very generous. And it's essentially an environment where people flourish. There's a lot of abundance here, even thinking-wise, not just financially. And I wrote this book because I care about human flourishing in general and about the environments that basically are conducive to human flourishing. That's essentially why I wrote the book. But I think when the environment is is hijacked by politicians, that makes me upset. For example, in Mozambique, there's unrest in Mozambique right now. It's on fire. Maputo is on fire. About 1,000 small businesses have been torched. The death toll is in the hundreds. And the reason is because the same party that my parents went to support 50 years ago, to help them build a country that would flourish, the same party has been in power with no interruptions for 50 years. It's going to be next year, 50 years. Well, obviously, if you're in power for 50 years, you're not going to do a good job. That makes me upset, right? It makes me upset because millions of people are hostages of this. I was making an announcement and appeal to my church here so we can send some money to some believers there who don't have enough food for the month because of the disruptions. And I was like looking up, I'm an economist, so I think in economics terms. In the 90s, the Mozambique, about 60% of the people lived on under $2 a day, which is the official World Bank line demarcating extreme poverty. Right below $2 a day, it's extreme poverty. It's very dangerous. So 60% in Mozambique in the 90s lived and this was actually, it was higher when we came. Not by much, but higher. And because of some of the corruption, some of the government dysfunction, some of the politics going on, today it's 74%. Three quarters of a nation of 30 million people are living on under $2 a day because of corrupt, greedy people, who most of them are actually probably very well educated and know better. And they keep those people in that state. That upsets me.
Understandably so. I wonder if I may to just take things up a pace on a more positive note, and
let's do that because
a
that
quick
was heavy.
fire round. Yeah, absolutely. But right, these things need to be discussed. And I asked the question, what makes you angry? And I don't want to, it would be rude of me not to give you that space. And I understand why. I mean, we share a similar view on these things. It's fair to say. But a quick fire round, if I may, 5 minutes of quick fire questions. On a more upbeat note, perhaps. First and foremost, who inspires you the most and why?
That's a very good question. Thank you for asking it. Today, I think on a global stage, Elon Musk inspires me. He really does. I mean, just how the brilliance, the breakthroughs he was able to pioneer, like one person, it's just extraordinary. It inspires me to remind myself and the people that I try to help, and even your audience, that one person can make a big difference in the world. And it doesn't have to be at the scale, right, of Elon Musk. I don't desire that. But I believe I can make a change and you can make a change, And so Elon is probably the one name that comes to mind right now.
What's a book or quote that has profoundly influenced your life?
Well, I would say the Bible in a huge way. It changed my life profoundly. Since my mid-20s, I grew up atheist, right? No one I knew believed in God, and it changed my life, like forever. I would say of the more modern stuff, it would be Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl.
Yeah.
That was a big one. Also pretty heavy, but it's just profound and powerful. From the modern ones, from the professional standpoint, I love Seth Godin's books. So he has a book called Lynchpin that I've read it 3-4 times. Stephen Pressfield has a book called The War of Art, and it's about the creative process and being a professional. So I have a long list, but those are the ones that come to mind right now.
If you could give one piece of advice to someone feeling stuck in life or perhaps in their career right now, what would it be?
Take a breather, take a step back. You really have a choice at any given moment. You either lower your goals or you elevate your habits. And I would say, if you dare to believe that you can elevate your habits, very, very simple changes that are daily, weekly, monthly, you can very boldly elevate your goals in ways that you haven't even considered to this point. So I'm a huge believer in incremental change that drives massive, massive transformation.
And what does living an extraordinary life mean to you?
I think it's love and purpose. That's it.
I don't know that it gets much better than that. I think you've summed that up perfectly. If a listener could take just one thing away from your story, Christian, what would you hope it would be?
I hope people would just understand that the obstacles that are perceived by them are not really obstacles, especially if you live in the free world in the West. And life is short, live boldly, try things, experiment, zigzag, don't specialize just because you want to be safe.
That's fabulous. I think that's a wonderful place to leave it. But importantly, I want to ensure that listeners know where they can go to find out more about you. Where should we point them? Where should we send them to find out more about you?
Well, if you're in the zone of Amazon, I would love for you to get my book called Little Book of Big Reasons to Love America. You can go on Amazon and get it pretty much anywhere. And that's one. I have a newsletter that drops every Sunday that I always invite people to. It's christianrayflores.com. It's the URL. And if you want to sort of get a gauge of where you are in life, I have a tool that I use in my coaching called the Exponential Radar. It's a really cool assessment. It's a self-assessment, but it walks you through like maybe 40 questions in about 8 minutes, maybe. If you answer those, you get in your inbox a really good report, basically evaluating the most important parts of your life. And I find that tool to be incredibly simple, but very, very powerful. I use it all the time with my clients, and I give it away for free. So if you go to exponential.life, and exponential is spelled without the E, it starts with an X, the cool way. And exponential.life, you'll find the tool there. It's called the Exponential Scorecard.
Fantastic. I'll make sure that we get all of that in the show notes for listeners. Christian Ray, it's been a pleasure to speak with you today. I really appreciate you taking the time out to speak with us and to leave us with so much by way of inspiration, so many I would determine them as real nuggets of gold, absolute gems of insight and opportunity. And I think you just give this sense of the endless possibilities that life presents us if we apply and persist and keep going, keep getting out there. So thank you. That's been a real pleasure. It's a wonderful experience to speak with you.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you so much for having me and giving me your time and the attention of your audience. I really treasure that.
Thank you. That's it for today's episode of Extrology. I hope you're walking away inspired by Christian's incredible story, proof that life's challenges can shape us into extraordinary individuals. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode, and check out our YouTube channel for video highlights and bonus content. And if you're craving even more inspiration, visit extrology.com for thought-provoking blogs and insight from past guests. Thanks for joining me today. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring. Just a reminder, today's podcast is brought to you by Progresso Talent Partners. Visit www.progressotalent.com today for more information.